Everyone at Riverside Speedway laughed when 18-year-old Maya Sullivan, the mechanic's daughter in grease-stained coveralls, rolled her beat-up Camaro to the starting line beside $40,000 racing machines. Track owner Richard Blackstone smirked from his luxury box, adjusting his gold Rolex as cameras captured what he expected to be the most entertaining failure of the season. The crowd's laughter echoed across the asphalt as Maya's car sputtered and backfired, black smoke billowing from the exhaust. But when Blackstone dared her to prove her Junkyard special belonged on his professional track, Maya's steady hands gripped the steering wheel with a confidence that made the laughter die in a few throats. What happened next would expose a 20-year-old secret that destroyed Blackstone's empire and revealed the true genius behind every innovation the racing world claimed as his own. Maya had grown up in the shadow of Riverside Speedway. Literally. Her father, Tony, operated Sullivan's auto repair in a cramped garage 3 blocks from the track, where the roar of engines provided the soundtrack to her childhood. While other kids played with dolls or video games, Maya learned to rebuild transmissions and tune carburetors by watching her father work in focused silence. The garage smelled of motor oil and old metal, a sharp contrast to the gleaming chrome and leather of the Speedway's corporate hospitality suites. Maya's coveralls bore patches from a dozen different oil changes, and her fingernails carried permanent traces of grease that no amount of scrubbing could remove. The racing community knew her as Tony's kid, the quiet girl who sometimes helped with tire changes during pit stops, invisible among the mechanics and drivers who commanded attention and respect. But Maya saw everything, absorbed every conversation about gear ratios and aerodynamics, filing away knowledge that would prove more valuable than anyone imagined. The annual Riverside Challenge had drawn drivers from across the state, each bringing machines worth more than most people's houses. Corporate sponsors lined the pit area with banners advertising everything from energy drinks to luxury cars, while television crews captured footage for the evening sports broadcasts. Richard Blackstone presided over it all, from his climate-controlled tower, a man who had transformed a small-town dirt track into a multi-million-dollar racing empire through what he called innovation and vision. His success story graced magazine covers and business school case studies. The self-made entrepreneur who revolutionized stock car racing through breakthrough engineering and aerodynamic design. The Blackstone name appeared on everything from racing schools to automotive patents. A brand built on the reputation of being the smartest man in the room. Maya watched him through the chain-link fence that separated the public viewing area from the exclusive corporate boxes, studying the way he gestured grandly while explaining racing strategy to reporters and investors. The trouble started when Maya approached the registration table with her entry fee in crumpled $20 bills. The officials looked from her beat-up Camaro to her grease-stained appearance and barely suppressed their laughter. Word spread quickly through the pit area that Tony, the mechanic's daughter, thought she could race with the professionals, a piece of gossip that reached Blackstone's ears within minutes. He descended from his tower like a king, addressing peasants, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the asphalt as he approached Maya's car with an entourage of photographers and track officials. The crowd gathered, sensing drama, as Blackstone circled the Camaro with exaggerated inspection, pointing out rust spots and mechanical flaws for the cameras. His voice carried across the pit area as he announced that while he admired the girl's enthusiasm, real racing required more than wishful thinking, and a 20-year-old car held together with duct tape and prayer. "Tell you what, sweetheart," Blackstone said, his voice dripping with condescension as the crowd pressed closer. "Since you've already paid your entry fee, I'll give you a sporting chance. But let's make this interesting for everyone. He gestured toward the assembled drivers and sponsors, his smile sharp as a blade. "If your little jalopy can beat even one car in the time trials just one, I'll personally sponsor your racing career for a full season. But when you lose, and we both know you will, you agree to stay off my track permanently. No more dreaming about things that are way out of your league." The crowd erupted in anticipation, some calling out encouragement, while others placed mock bets on how quickly Maya's car would break down. Cameras clicked and whirred, capturing what everyone assumed would be a humiliating moment that would end a naive girl's racing dreams forever. Blackstone's associates chuckled at his theatrical generosity, knowing full well that no amateur driver in a rebuilt streetcar could compete against professional racers in purpose-built machines. Maya felt the weight of 100 stares as she stood beside her car, but her voice remained steady when she accepted the challenge. "One condition," she said, loud enough for the microphones to catch. "When I win, you tell everyone the truth about where your revolutionary designs really came from." The crowd stirred at this unexpected response, but Blackstone's laughter boomed across the speedway. He extended his hand with theatrical flourish, agreeing to terms he considered impossible, while photographers captured the handshake between the racing mogul and the mechanic's daughter. Maya's calm confidence unsettled a few observers, particularly the older mechanics who had worked the circuit long enough to recognize something in her posture that suggested this wasn't mere bravado. But most dismissed her quiet determination as the delusion of someone too young to understand the gap between amateur enthusiasm and professional competence. The time trials began with the newest, most expensive cars, taking their turns around the track. Sleek machines worth more than most houses roared past the grandstands, their engines producing precise, controlled power that spoke of thousands of hours of professional tuning and aerodynamic optimization. Television commentators provided running analysis of lap times and technical specifications, while corporate executives smiled for cameras beside their sponsored vehicles. Maya used this time to prepare her own car, working with tools that looked ancient compared to the computer diagnostic equipment used by professional teams. Her father had taught her that understanding came through touch and sound rather than digital readouts, that a properly tuned engine would tell you its secrets if you knew how to listen. She adjusted carburetor settings with practiced precision, checking ignition timing by ear rather than electronic instruments, making modifications that seemed insignificant but would prove decisive when it mattered most. When Maya's turn came, the crowd had already begun to disperse, convinced that the spectacle was over before it began. Her Camaro rolled to the starting line, with none of the dramatic flourish of the professional entries. Its primer gray paint and hand-lettered number contrasting sharply with the sponsor-covered machines that had preceded it. Television cameras focused on Blackstone's expectant face rather than the track itself, anticipating his reaction to what everyone assumed would be an embarrassing failure. Maya settled into the driver's seat, her hands finding familiar positions on the steering wheel and gear shifter, feeling the car's personality through vibrations that had become as natural as her own heartbeat. The engine's idle sounded rough and uneven compared to the professional machines, but Maya heard something in its rhythm that spoke of hidden potential waiting to be unleashed. The green flag dropped, and Maya's Camaro exploded forward with a roar that caught everyone off guard. The car that had sputtered and backfired in the pit area now screamed down the straightaway with raw power that made spectators step back from the fence. Maya's driving showed none of the hesitation or nervousness everyone expected from an amateur, instead demonstrating the smooth precision of someone who understood exactly what her machine could do. She took the first turn at a speed that should have sent her sliding into the wall, but the car held its line with stability that impressed even skeptical professionals. The crowd's laughter had died completely, replaced by surprised murmurs as Maya's lap time appeared on the electronic boards, showing a pace that put her in the middle of the professional field. The real shock came on the second lap, when Maya began pushing her car to limits that defied everything the observers thought they knew about automotive performance. Her Camaro cornered with the precision of a much more expensive machine, its suspension and handling characteristics suggesting modifications that weren't visible to casual inspection. Professional drivers in the pit area stopped their conversations to watch as Maya carved through turns with lines that demonstrated not just natural talent, but deep technical understanding of racing dynamics. Her lap times improved steadily, each circuit around the track revealing new aspects of her car's capabilities and her own driving skills. By the time she crossed the finish line, Maya had posted a time that placed her third overall, ahead of several professional drivers in purpose-built racing machines worth 10 times what she had invested in her Camaro. The speedway fell silent, except for the echo of Maya's engine as she coasted to a stop in front of the grandstand. Professional drivers stood beside their expensive machines with expressions of disbelief, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Television commentators struggled to find words that could explain how an 18-year-old girl in a rebuilt streetcar had outperformed seasoned professionals with unlimited budgets and factory support. Blackstone's face had gone pale, his confident smile replaced by a look of confusion and growing concern as the implications of Maya's performance began to sink in. The crowd slowly began to react. At first, with scattered applause that built into genuine appreciation for what they had seen. But the mood remained tense, as everyone waited to see how the track owner would respond to his very public challenge being met. Maya climbed out of her car and walked directly to where Blackstone stood frozen beside the timing tower. Her coveralls still bearing the same grease stains, but her presence somehow transformed by what had just occurred. "I kept my part of the bargain," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "Now it's time for you to keep yours." She reached into her car and pulled out a worn leather portfolio that had been secured behind the driver's seat, its edges softened by years of handling, and its surface marked with oil, stains, and fingerprints. The crowd pressed closer as Maya opened the portfolio to reveal detailed engineering drawings, technical specifications, and design notes that looked decades old, but contained innovations that had defined modern stock car racing. Blackstone's face went from pale to ashen as he recognized diagrams that had supposedly originated from his own engineering team. Revolutionary concepts that had built his reputation and fortune. "These belong to my mother," Maya said, her voice steady, but carrying an edge that made several people step closer to hear every word. "Elena Sullivan was the chief engineer at Riverside Development Corporation before you bought the company in 2003. She designed every innovation you've claimed as your own. From the aerodynamic packages to the suspension systems that made your cars faster than anything else on the track." She held up a technical drawing that showed the exact specifications of what Blackstone had marketed as his breakthrough chassis design, the signature innovation that had launched his empire. The date in the corner showed it had been completed 2 years before Blackstone had even entered the racing business. Signed with Elena Sullivan's precise engineering notation. Professional drivers and mechanics who had gathered around began to recognize details from cars they had driven and worked on. Innovations they had assumed came from Blackstone's well-funded research and development team. The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd as the implications became clear. Elena Sullivan had been more than just an engineer. She had been the visionary whose designs had revolutionized stock car racing. Her work forming the foundation of an industry that had generated millions in profits while her name had been erased from history. Maya continued pulling documents from the portfolio, each one revealing another aspect of her mother's genius that had been claimed by Blackstone and his corporation. Patents that bore his name showed suspicious similarities to Elena's original designs. Modified just enough to avoid direct copying, but clearly derived from her fundamental innovations. Technical specifications that had supposedly taken Blackstone's team years to develop matched exactly with Elena's notes from decades earlier, proving a pattern of intellectual theft that went far beyond simple inspiration or coincidence. My mother was going to expose what you had done. Maya continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke, the truth that had been buried for 20 years. She had copies of everything. Proof that you had stolen her life's work and passed it off as your own. But 3 days before she planned to go public, she died in a car accident on Highway 47, the same stretch of road where the county had been reporting brake failures in vehicles serviced by shops that used defective parts. The crowd stirred uneasily at this implication, but Maya pressed on without giving anyone time to interrupt. The insurance investigation was closed quickly, ruled as driver error, despite evidence that her brakes had failed completely. The original police report disappeared from the files, along with the mechanic's statement about the brake components that had been installed just weeks before the accident. Blackstone finally found his voice, though it came out strained and defensive. This is ridiculous. Your mother was just one of many engineers who worked for the company. These designs were developed by teams of people over many years. But his protests sounded hollow in the face of the documentary evidence that Maya continued to produce. Each piece of paper revealing another aspect of Elena Chen's contributions that had been systematically erased from the official record. Professional drivers who had benefited from the innovations now looked uncomfortable, realizing they had built their careers on technology that had been stolen from a woman whose name they had never heard. Television cameras that had been expecting to capture a humiliating failure were instead recording what looked like the exposure of one of racing's biggest scandals. A story that would dominate sports headlines for months to come. Maya reached the final document in her mother's portfolio. A comprehensive report that detailed not just the technical innovations, but also Elena's growing suspicions about Blackstone's business practices and her plans to expose the truth. The report included copies of internal corporate communications that showed Blackstone had been aware of Elena's concerns and had taken active steps to discredit her work and isolate her from other engineers who might have supported her claims. Phone records and meeting notes revealed a pattern of harassment and intimidation that had escalated in the weeks before Elena's death, painting a picture of a woman who had been systematically destroyed for threatening to expose the truth about the empire built on her stolen genius. The crowd's mood had shifted completely from entertainment to horror as the scope of the revelation became clear. This wasn't just about racing or corporate theft. It was about a woman's life and legacy being erased to protect a powerful man's reputation and fortune. Maya's performance on the track had been impressive, but it paled in comparison to the bombshell. She was now detonating in full view of cameras and witnesses who would carry the story far beyond the confines of Riverside Speedway. Several professional drivers stepped forward to examine the documents more closely, their expertise allowing them to verify the authenticity and significance of Elena's designs. Their murmured confirmations rippled through the crowd, lending credibility to accusations that might otherwise have been dismissed as the fantasies of a grieving daughter. Blackstone made one final attempt to control the narrative, stepping forward with the authoritative presence that had served him well in boardrooms and television interviews. Even if these documents are real, which I doubt, they don't prove anything beyond the fact that Elena Chen was one of many contributors to innovations that were developed through collaborative effort and significant investment. His voice carried the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to talking his way out of difficult situations. But the assembled crowd was no longer inclined to accept his explanations at face value. Maya had anticipated this response. pulling out her phone to show a video that had been recorded by her father years earlier. Elena Chen herself explaining her designs and expressing her concerns about Blackstone's appropriation of her work. The woman on the screen bore a clear resemblance to Maya. Her intelligence and passion evident as she detailed innovations that would later make Blackstone famous and wealthy. The video evidence proved devastating to Blackstone's credibility, showing Elena Chen not just as a brilliant engineer, but as someone who had been fully aware of the theft of her intellectual property and had been preparing to fight back before her untimely death. Her technical explanations demonstrated a depth of understanding that made it clear these weren't borrowed or collaborative ideas, but original innovations that had sprung from her unique vision and expertise. Professional engineers in the crowd could see immediately that Elena's work represented the kind of breakthrough thinking that only came from exceptional individual talent, not the committee-driven development that Blackstone claimed had produced the same results. The video also revealed Elena's personality, showing her to be articulate, confident, and methodical in her approach to both engineering and documentation. Exactly the kind of person who would have kept detailed records of her work and Blackstone's theft. The consequences began almost immediately, as word of Maya's revelations spread beyond the speedway. Television crews that had come to cover a local racing event found themselves with a major story that combined sports, corporate corruption, and possible murder. Exactly the kind of narrative that would capture national attention. Social media began buzzing with discussions of the scandal. Racing fans sharing and analyzing the evidence that Maya had presented, while investigative journalists started digging into Blackstone's background and business practices. Racing industry executives who had worked with Blackstone over the years began reviewing their own experiences, looking for signs of the deception that had apparently been hidden in plain sight for 2 decades. Federal investigators arrived at Riverside Speedway within 48 hours, drawn by the combination of intellectual property theft, potential securities fraud, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding Elena Chen's death. The documents that Maya had preserved became the foundation for a comprehensive investigation that would eventually encompass multiple agencies and jurisdictions, each following different threads of evidence that all led back to Blackstone's systematic theft of Elena's innovations. Patentfraude, tax evasion, and conspiracy charges began to pile up as investigators uncovered the full scope of the deception that had built Blackstone's empire on the foundation of a dead woman's genius. Blackstone's carefully constructed world began to collapse with shocking speed. Corporate sponsors pulled their support as news of the scandal dominated headlines, unwilling to associate their brands with someone accused of intellectual theft and possibly much worse. Racing organizations stripped him of honorary positions and banned him from events, while business partners began distancing themselves from someone who had become radioactive in the world of professional sports. The stock price of Blackstone Racing Enterprises plummeted as investors fled, wiping out hundreds of millions in market value and triggering investigations by financial regulators who suspected securities fraud in the company's representations about its proprietary technology. The personal cost proved even more devastating than the business consequences, as Blackstone's reputation crumbled under the weight of evidence that continued to emerge. Former employees came forward with stories of suspicious business practices and Elena Chen's growing isolation in the months before her death, painting a picture of a woman who had been systematically undermined and threatened for refusing to stay silent about the theft of her work. The criminal investigation into Elena's death was reopened, with new evidence suggesting that her car had been deliberately sabotaged to prevent her from exposing Blackstone's crimes. DNA evidence that had been overlooked 20 years earlier was re-examined with modern techniques, revealing traces that supported the theory of deliberate mechanical sabotage. Maya found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never sought, but she handled the attention with the same quiet confidence she had shown behind the wheel of her race car. Television interviews and newspaper profiles revealed her to be articulate and determined, driven not by desire for revenge, but by need to restore her mother's legacy and ensure that Elena Chen's contributions to racing technology would finally receive proper recognition. She used her newfound platform to establish the Elena Chen Foundation for Engineering Excellence, dedicated to supporting young women pursuing careers in automotive engineering and racing technology. The foundation's first scholarship recipients included several promising students who had been inspired by Maya's story to pursue their own dreams, despite financial or social obstacles. The racing community's response to Maya's revelations proved more complex than simple support or condemnation. Many drivers and teams who had benefited from the stolen technology found themselves in uncomfortable positions, forced to acknowledge that their success had been built on innovations they had never properly credited to their true creator. Some embraced the opportunity to honor Elena Chen's memory by publicly acknowledging her contributions and supporting Maya's foundation, while others struggled with the implications of learning that their achievements had been tainted by crimes they had never suspected. The sport itself began a process of historical revision, updating records and documentation to properly credit Elena Chen with innovations that had been attributed to Blackstone for 20 years. Maya's racing career took off in ways she had never imagined possible, with offers pouring in from teams and sponsors who wanted to associate themselves with someone who had become a symbol of integrity triumphing over corruption. But she chose her opportunities carefully, selecting partners who shared her commitment to honest competition and technical excellence, rather than simply chasing the biggest contracts or most prestigious rides. Her mother's engineering knowledge, combined with her own natural driving talent, made her a formidable competitor who could communicate with technical teams in ways that few drivers could match. Race after race, Maya demonstrated that her performance at Riverside Speedway had been no fluke, consistently running at the front of fields filled with drivers who had much more experience and resources. The legal proceedings against Blackstone stretched on for months, each revelation adding new dimensions to a scandal that seemed to grow more complex with every passing week. The intellectual property theft charges were relatively straightforward, supported by overwhelming documentary evidence that Maya had preserved through years of her mother's careful documentation. But the conspiracy and murder charges proved more difficult to prosecute, requiring investigators to reconstruct events from 20 years earlier, using evidence that had been deliberately hidden or destroyed. Witnesses who had been too frightened to speak up at the time of Elena's death now came forward with testimony that supported the theory of deliberate sabotage. But proving criminal intent beyond reasonable doubt required painstaking detective work that tested the limits of modern forensic science. When the verdicts finally came down, they vindicated everything that Maya had risked her reputation to expose. Blackstone was convicted on multiple counts of intellectual property theft, securities fraud, and conspiracy. Sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, with restitution orders that would strip him of virtually everything he had gained through his crimes. The murder charges resulted in a hung jury, but civil courts found him liable for Elena Chen's wrongful death, adding millions more to the financial penalty that would ensure he could never profit from his crimes again. More importantly for Maya, the legal proceedings had definitively established her mother's role as the true genius behind innovations that had transformed racing, ensuring that Elena Chen's name would be permanently associated with achievements that had been stolen for 2 decades. Maya returned to Riverside Speedway exactly 1 year after her explosive revelation, this time as the featured driver in a race renamed the Elena Chen Memorial Classic. The track had been sold to new owners who were committed to honoring the memory of the woman whose innovations had made modern racing possible, and they had invited Maya to participate in a ceremony that would permanently recognize her mother's contributions to the sport. The same grandstands that had witnessed her humiliation and triumph now hosted a celebration of justice delayed but not denied. With racing legends and engineering pioneers joining Maya in paying tribute to Elena Chen's legacy. As Maya climbed into a race car for the memorial event, she carried with her the same worn leather portfolio that had contained the evidence that brought down Richard Blackstone's empire. But now it also held new documents, engineering plans, and technical innovations that she and her father had developed together. Building on Elena's foundation to create the next generation of racing technology, the portfolio had evolved from a repository of stolen dreams into a blueprint for the future, one that would be built on the bedrock of honesty, technical excellence, and respect for the innovators whose genius made progress possible. The race itself proved anticlimactic compared to the drama that had preceded it. But Maya's victory lap carried special significance as she drove past grandstands filled with people who understood they were witnessing not just the end of one story, but the beginning of another. Elena Chen's daughter had done more than expose corruption and restore a stolen legacy. She had demonstrated that truth and talent could triumph over power and deception when courage and determination refused to accept injustice as permanent. The crowd's cheers echoed across the speedway as Maya raised her mother's portfolio toward the sky, a symbol of dreams that had survived 20 years of suppression to finally receive the recognition they had always deserved.